WP-Get Web Dev Tutorials for all user levels. Alright, so a couple of days ago I put up a tutorial showing some new thinking on my part on the way of linking sliders, etc. together. And this first demonstration here was exactly what's in there. Now this is using the Elementor slider widget, which uses the Swiper.js library. I did say I was going to do the same thing for a JetElements slider, and this is what I've done here. So on the left-hand side, I've got a JetElements slider with 3 slides, no background images. The descriptions are a paragraph of text, no thumbnails down the bottom, and I've got a fade effect for as it transitions. On the right-hand side, JetElements slider with a background image and thumbnails down the bottom, and using the slide effect, not the fade effect. And these two are linked together, as you can see. So if I click on any of these, so the thumbnails, navigation, or the navigation on this other one, all of them change. It's also swipe aware, so touch aware. So for mobile, if I just click and drag, go to the next one, same as on that side there. So they're all linked beautifully together. So that's pretty much what I want to show today. I'm loving this way of working. It's such a clean way of linking things together. And the code really only varies depending on which library they've used. I'm going to show you back to that, and I'll put this all up on my tutorial as the custom code. So let's have a look at the sliders. So the first slider here is a standard slider. And that is, if I type in slider, see we've got our standard slides, which is the Elementor native slider. Got this colored one here called slider, which is the JetElements slider, and that's what these two are here. So the first one here, if I look at my content, all I've done is got rid of the background image, call it slide 1, added some nice big body text in there, and got rid of the hash for the button URL so that it doesn't show a button. You can remove all this if you want here. And then basically slides 2 and 3 are just duplicates of that with different content in the description and a different slide number. The settings, we've got it set to defaults here. What have I done differently? I've got autoplay turned off. What else have we got here? Display full screen button turned off because we don't want to show a full screen button. So JetElements slider has a little button that comes up here. See this little arrows up the top right, and you can go full screen. We don't need that for this text. With that turned off, we want the touch effect, so you can use your finger on a touch screen. We don't want to shuffle. We want a loop, which is default. We want to use the fade effect, so as we move from one slide to the next, it just fades there. And that's pretty much all I've changed on there, apart from the style, where I've just set the colors here. So I've just got white text, slightly grey subtitle, and white body copy in the description. Let's just set that to white. And that's pretty much all I've done with this slide here. The second slide is each of these has a background image with the same deal, just a very basic setting. I've left the hash in there so it shows the button, and then just duplicated this slide a few times, and that's pretty much all I've done for that. Settings are pretty much the same. So my scale mode is cover for my images. Autoplay is off, and the fade effect is no, which means that as I click on these, it actually slides from one to the next, and it's not fading from one to the next. Now you notice these aren't linked in the editor, and that's because of the way the code runs. So which is I'm fine with. So just as I did with these native Elementor slider widgets, when I click on the widget, go to the advanced, and I've got a attribute here which is data remote group, and in this case I've called it slides C. And as long as we have the same data remote group slide whatever on the other one, so if we look at the other JetSlider there, our attributes, So that one's on slide C as well, which links these two sliders together. Now, caveat here is I'm not going to work on linking different types of sliders. So I'm not going to work on linking the Elementor native slider with the JetSlider, etc. Because they use different libraries, it'll get tricky. You have to have all sorts of business logic to work out what to do in different circumstances. So I'm just linking JetSlider to JetSlider. So over to our code. So all of this code I went through yesterday or the day before yesterday when I talked about the Elementor native sliders. Now the Elementor native sliders use a JavaScript library called Swiper. The JetSlider uses a Slider Pro library. So it's a completely different library that it uses, so we have to treat it differently. So all we're doing is saying if the widget is a JetSlider, so let's have a look at that and just show you where I'm getting that from again. If I just use my selector and go to my widget, there's my widget there. There it is there. Sorry, there's the widget there. And the data widget type is a JetSlider. So again, we're not worried about the dot default, just the JetSlider is the widget type. So in our switch here, we're looking for any JetSlider, call init slider pro widget and pass in the jQuery reference to that widget. So init slider pro widget is here. And again, same as the one we did for Swiper, we're just looking for the data remote group. If it exists, then we're going to initialize the linking of this. If it doesn't exist, do nothing. So if you don't put a data remote group attribute on the slider, it just gets ignored. Okay, so if in this case we've got slides C on both of these, so it's going to call the slider pro remote init. And by the way, I've got in the description here, I've got a link to the documents for Slider Pro, so you can see what other attributes it has and what you can do with it. So coming down to the Slider Pro remote init, we've got our scope and group, exactly the same as what we did with the other one. In this case, we need to find the Slider-Pro class. Now that is the wrapper that Slider Pro creates for its slider. With the Elementor ones, we're looking for a Swiper, which is a different library. So we find our Slider Pro. The wrapper is or the container is our Slider Pro container. Just set a ref variable. Again, we use a timeout and wait for 100 milliseconds. The reason we do that is when these initializers run, normally the JavaScript to create the slider hasn't run yet, so I'm just waiting 100 milliseconds for that to happen. I'm hoping that's enough generally. If there's any problems with that, you can just increase that time. Right, so once we've waited for the Slider Pro JS to initialize the slider, we then want to create a listener for on go to slide. Again, you can look at the docs for that. So on go to slide. Now, it passes in a event, and on that event, there's two properties, which is the index and the previous index. And what we want is the actual index. This is a little bit different to the way Swiper works. We can get that index from the Swiper reference. With Slider Pro, we can't. There's no property that works for that. So what I'm going to do is pass it in on this event listener. So basically, whenever we go to slide, call this go to Slider Pro remote handle change, pass in our slider reference, what is the group that it belongs to, and what current index was just transitioned to or clicked on. All right, same as the above function here. If we don't have any references to that group, create an empty array on that group. If we do, or once we've created that, then we want to push our reference onto Slider Pro group. So we end up with, in this case, we've got two connected sliders for that group. So group called slide C will end up having a Slider Pro reference for each of these two here. Clear as mud? Okay, great. All right, so that's pretty much how that works, and it's exactly the same as what we did for the Swiper, except for we're passing in a different event listener and we're sending off the actual index with the listener because of the way that library works. The rest of it is exactly the same. And this is what I am trying to do, is trying to keep as much as the code as possible the same, so it's not confusing. You can go back to this and easily figure it out, because all we have to change is whatever is different about that library, not everything, the way we handle it. So, okay, so we're going to call our Slider Pro remote handle change. So whenever any of these slides change, whether you've clicked on the navigation, on the thumbnail, or used your finger on a touchscreen, whenever that changes, any one of these, it'll throw this event, pass in this index in the event, and then we can handle the remote change. All right, so again, we've got a variable here for a debouncing of our slider. So we don't want to have one trigger another one and have that one trigger that one and have it end up with a loop of sliders triggering each other. This is exactly the same concept as the previous function, where we're only allowing one trigger to happen every 500 milliseconds. So now we want to get our Slider Pro group references for that group. So we're passing in the group of, in this case, slide C. So we're getting all of the Slider Pro references for slide C, iterate through them. I'm calling the reference to that is a JSRef in this case, just to be more generic. And if our trigger reference is the same as the current reference, then just ignore it. Otherwise, tell it to go to the next slide. So what that's doing, if we click on a button here to go to the next slide, it's going to ignore updating this because this is the one that did the update. It's going to get to the next one, and it's going to tell that one to go to the next slide. If we had a third slider in slide C, it would tell the third slider to go to the next slide as well, go to the indexed slide. So that's pretty much all there is to it. Everything is exactly the same functionality as what we had for the standard Elementor widgets slider widget. The way we handle the initialization, just make sure it's a JetSlider, init the Slider Pro widget, init Slider Pro widget, only inits if it's got a remote group defined, data remote group defined, then inits the slider for that, and then sets a handler to listen for when a slide changes, and then on the change it goes through and it tells all the other sliders in that group to go to whatever the index is that just changed. A little complex, but I think it's a really nice way of handling this because we can add more to this. If I have a different library, or even, for example, with the Jet engine, they've got carousels as well that use the same library. So I can actually add maybe a break here. It might be the case of doing something like this. We'd have to find out exactly what it is, but it might be get jet carousel. Now, if there is a jet carousel widget and it uses the Slider Pro, this would work exactly the same, and that would add that to the same group. Caveat being that the carousel and the slider just has to have the same number of elements, so same number of slides, and that will work. Now, I haven't tested this, but by all means, go through and figure it out for yourself and have a play. But I like this idea because it's anything that uses a swiper. In here, we can add another case and tell it to initialize the swiper for that widget, and that will add it to the group. Anything that uses the Slider Pro widget, we can add another case and init that for the same group. So anything that uses the same JavaScript library, we can link those elements together or those widgets together. So I really like this way of doing it, and I hope you do too.